Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's event. My name is Dr. Akisi Britton, and along with my colleagues, Drs. Kim Butler and Shanti Rosado, I co-direct Insurgent Intersections, Combating Global Anti-Blackness, a project of the Department of Africana Studies. This is a project at the Department of Africana Studies here at Rutgers University, New Brunswick, and we thank the department and the Institute for the Study of Global Racial Justice for their generous support and funding. Insurgent Intersections explores how the discipline of Africana Studies informs global intersectional struggles against anti-Blackness. We see this initiative as a way to highlight the critical work of Africana Studies in understanding how anti-Blackness is at the core of countless local and global social problems. Given the failure of current interventions to address anti-Blackness and racism in general, it's vital that we shift our focus to the insights, priorities, and strategies that come from the lived experiences of those most directly affected. That knowledge comes not only from the academy, but also from the work of activists, artists, and everyday community members. Insurgent Intersections places these voices in dialogue to inform a new way forward towards social justice. Each year of the project is devoted to a specific theme. Last year, we inaugurated the project with a deep look into the roots of global anti-Blackness. You can catch up on last year's keynote and other events on our website. Tonight, we begin our look into what we are calling the mechanisms of anti-Blackness, how anti-Blackness shows up today. Sorry, excuse me. Some may think that because we may not see the blatant manifestations of lynching or segregated water fountains, or that we could point to Black elected officials and Black people in the high ranks of corporate life, that anti-Blackness is no longer as serious a problem as it once was. But when we look at a situation like Flint's water crisis, who's to say we don't still have segregated water access? When Ahmaud Arbery ran for his life in Georgia, how different was the panic in his heart than those who ran from the Klan? But let's take this a step further. Anti-Blackness, as it's manifested today, comes in many, many forms that are not so easily identified. Ruha Benjamin reminds us that the artificial intelligence that is based on whiteness as normative and Blackness as the other sometimes will have trouble sensing a hand to be washed or a presence to be avoided by a self-driving vehicle. Anti-Blackness comes in municipal decisions about spaces deemed of such little value that they can be seized by eminent domain. It comes in boardrooms and classrooms where there's just not quite the same level of comfort and familiarity. So people don't get invited to the after hours dinners and golf rounds where connections and decisions are made. And sometimes anti-Blackness comes at the hands of other Black people. Tonight, we begin to explore the mechanisms of anti-Blackness with the keynote and multiple voices. We do have a slight change to our schedule. Unfortunately, Don Muzan will not be joining us because of a death in the family. Also, our very own Kim Butler just came back from a dental procedure and can't speak, but she will be here and participating in the chat. We look forward to your thoughts and questions. Please be reminded to place your questions in the Q&A down below, but also feel free to use the chat. We know it's always popping in the chat. Thank you all so much for joining us. And now I will begin by introducing tonight's guests. First, we will start with Dr. Nikol Alexander-Floyd. Dr. Alexander-Floyd is professor of political science at Rutgers University, New Brunswick. A lawyer and political scientist, Dr. Alexander-Floyd has been actively engaged in a wide range of political and legal issues. A strong advocate for minorities, particularly women of color, she co-founded the Association for the Study of Black Women in Politics, an organization dedicated to supporting the development of Black women's and gender studies and the professionalization of Black women political scientists. As a legal theorist and activist, she has produced scholarship and provided commentary on some of the cutting-edge legal cases of our time. Her involvement and leadership around the important Hopwood case in Texas led to guest appearances on the Oprah Winfrey Show and National Public Radio. Dr. Alexander-Floyd is the author of Reimagining Black Women, a critique of post-feminist and post-racial melodrama in culture and politics, and Gender, Race, and Nationalism in Contemporary Black Politics. Today, Dr. Alexander-Floyd will discuss the ways anti-Blackness shows up in popular culture. We're also asking Dr. Alexander-Floyd to speak to the issues of Black women in politics and their significance for this election. And I will cede the floor to Dr. Alexander-Floyd.
All right, good evening, everyone. I just want to begin by thanking Jenny Jiang and Kesey Britton, and of course, the inimitable Professor Kim Butler for just inviting me to be, participant here today. I've been looking forward to this discussion. Excited about talking about the topic with all the esteemed colleagues here. And, I'm hit my timer here for 10 minutes because I am from Louisiana, AKA the boot. And as one of my friends said, that we get vaccinated with a phonograph needle, we can just go on and on and on. So I want to make sure that I stick to the 10 minutes of time. So if I had to, I suppose, give a title to my thoughts for tonight, it would have to be hidden in plain sight. Hidden in plain sight. Part of what I deal with in my latest work, Reimagining Black Women, is post-feminist and post-racial politics. And I deal with how certain isms are hidden in plain sight that we have seen in this era, not only anti-Blackness, for instance, in ways that are very direct, though that still happens, but for several decades, right, there has been a push, right, and I call them post-racial fantasies, right, because it really speaks to a desire to be beyond, right, having to deal with questions of racism, questions of inequality. And it surfaces in a number of ways. Sometimes a push for a new traditionalism. Very often it will happen in what's been called a kind of, doing and undoing, right, of feminism or of anti-racism, so that people actually embrace at one level or acknowledge the civil rights movement or feminist movement or fighting sexism or racism, but only to suggest that that's no longer necessary, that that's somehow in the past, right? And so the kind of proliferation of those ideas through formal politics, but also through popular culture, the TV shows we watch, the books that we read, the movies that we view as well, actually helps to explain why some people were taken off guard with the rise of Donald Trump, right, and the kind of movement that he's ushered in, kind of basically ushering in, us close to fascism in this country, and really shaking our political process in some very significant and foundational ways. And so part of what I want to kind of use to, and someone is not here today, you said, so do we have more time, or are we still doing the 10 minutes? What's the deal?
We have a little extra time, just a little bit,
Okay, just a little bit. All right. So I selected basically, and I'm just gonna maybe pop this up on the screen. I don't have a PowerPoint, I just have one image that I wanted to show. This particular image really shows what I find and analyze in terms of the help. Now, can somebody tell me who remembers watching The Help or reading The Help? Okay. All right, so I use this as an example or case study, if you will, to look at the ways, and part of what I do in my work is to actually use a couple of different tools, including psychoanalysis. So I wanted to really pinpoint the kinds of unconscious processes at work at times in terms of how these things happen and proliferate in plain sight. So what I do is to actually compare the, let me see if I can get some people here. Show the video panel, okay. To actually compare 3 versions of the help, right? The first is Telling Memories, and it's a book of oral histories that was actually edited by a white woman. I think it was a librarian. Yeah, it was published by LSU Press. But they provided that book of oral histories provided the kind of a basis for the help, right? When Stockett was doing research, he basically drew on this material. So I compare how issues around racism and particularly white male rape of Black women in domestic spaces was handled there, the book version of the help, and then the movie version of the help. And so as this image depicts, right, there's a kind of movement in terms of the unconscious processes or the processes that are taking place, psychological processes. In Telling Memories, which is an oral history, right, denial is on display, right? There's very limited discussion, but there it is there. In the book version of the help, there's disavowal, right? It's basically turned to an interracial romance, and the help is basically repressed, right, or erased from the story. So in the book, Telling Memories, the very first story is from a Black woman whose mother was a nursemaid. It was post-slavery, but they were living on a plantation, a former plantation, and were sharecroppers. And her mother told her, make sure that you never nurse any children before your own. This woman knew that her father was a white overseer that owned this plantation space. He would sometimes send money through or other things through a brother or others, but never had a relationship with her. This person talks about her disdain for her father, and she understands the sexual abuse at the heart of her mother's relationship with this white man. Others in Telling Memories talk about, and these are former domestic laborers, Black domestic laborers, talk about how their mothers taught them before they went to work to be wary of what could happen, sometimes giving them blades or other things. And so there is mention of this, but the author, the person who edits Telling Memories, didn't put any question about sexual assault in the in her survey, which she does mention, and she has a theory for why perhaps she left this out, and yet and still people talk about it. But the domestic laborers themselves talk about it, and they talk about the denial of the sexual assault of white men, of Black women by white men. In the book version of the help, there is a figure that Constantine, if you recall, if you read the book, if you haven't read the book, please don't. But she basically is based on this woman who is the first person interviewed in Telling Memories. But it's turned into a love story, right? So there's disavowal, there's an interracial romance. And if you've read the book, you know that her father looks like Abraham Lincoln. I mean, she didn't even try to mess around with it. She just went for the great emancipator, you know. And so also in the book, when Constantine has a child, her child comes out very fair. And so when she goes, if you remember in the book and in the movie, there's a scene where her daughter goes to a gathering of the Daughters of the Republic, or I don't know, some white racist group. And the main character's mother knows that she is a Black woman and, you know, has her out for it and gets rid of her and her mother, right? In the movie version of the help, that completely drops out, right? The interracial romance piece of it. There still is this daughter that comes back. She's a brown-skinned Black woman, so you don't get the storylines about her being a problem for her mother, who gets asked questions because of her the difference in their skin complexions. How Constantine supposedly sends her daughter off to Chicago to an orphanage because she just can't deal with the stress of having a light-skinned child, who comes to find her. And so you have all of that intrigue, and all those elements of the story drop out in the movie version. So that history of white male rape of Black women is actually something that's repressed. It's a history of the story. And I'll just quickly add that part of what I look at is that even so, and this is what's represented here in this image, it still haunts that film, because the emphasis that it places on sanitation, on toileting, all and boundary violations really is a stand-in for the abjection of Black women and the violation of Black women. And so it haunts the film in that way. And I'll just end by saying that part of, some of you may know this, like in New Jersey, domestic workers used to have to get tested for syphilis before they went to work in white people's homes. And even at that time, the medical community didn't know that syphilis was something that was contracted through sexual contact. Now, that's again just another way in which there is a kind of unspoken, something hidden in plain sight. If you remember Strom Thurmond, when he died, people wanted to make something of the fact that lo and behold, he had a Black child. Well, no, sexual access to Black people's bodies, men and women, is part of what racism is about. Now, the denial of that, disavowal, the repression happens. It still haunts us today. And when we think about how Black women are not seen as people who are valuable, who can be, assault against us is something that it actually is taken seriously and taken into account. The continued violation, our sexual violation is often not legible in popular culture, law, and public policy. And I'll just say that part of what we, but this campaign piece of it, we have seen in political science for decades. Some of us who do work on Black women have been arguing about the critical role of Black women in politics and the importance of centering Black women in our analysis. And so people are beginning to take note of that, but there needs to be a broader discussion about the connection between what it is that we do for parties, impact politically, and then what we actually get in terms of the love language of policy, if you will. But you can see too the way in which Black women are represented in popular culture, the denigration of our persons, either making us asexual or hypersexual. All of those things come into play in politics, formal politics, and informal politics as well. So I'll stop there. I know we're going to have a chance to discuss, and I'm looking forward to hearing what others are saying in terms of their take on how anti-Blackness operates today.
Thank you. Okay, you got us started today. Thank you, Dr. Alexander-Floyd, for those comments. I'm really looking forward to our panel discussion later on in this webinar. Okay, now we are moving to Dr. Donna Murch. Donna Murch is Associate Professor of History at Rutgers University, where she is chapter president of the New Brunswick chapter of Rutgers AAUP AFT. Her newest book, Assata Taught Me, State Violence, Racial Capitalism, and the Movement for Black Lives, was published by Haymarket Books in March 2022. In October 2010, Dr. Murch published Living for the City, Migration, Education, and the Rise of the Black Panther Party in Oakland, California, with the University of North Carolina Press, which won the Phyllis Wheatley Prize in December 2011. Professor Murch is currently completing a new trade press book entitled Crack in Los Angeles, Policing the Crisis and the War on Drugs. This evening, I lost my place. Okay, Dr. Murch has written for the Sunday Washington Post, The Guardian, New Republic, Nation, Boston Review, and a range of wonderful publications. This evening, we asked Dr. Murch to discuss the intersections of anti-Blackness with labor, union organizing, and the contemporary capitalist ecosystem. So thank you again, Dr. Murch, for joining us, and you have the floor.
Thank you so much. I'm thrilled to be here. Being with all my amazing colleagues reminds me of how much I love Rutgers and how fortunate I am to be a part of this community. I'd like to thank Jenny Jang, Professors Butler, Asado, and Britton for bringing us all together to rethink the politics of global anti-Blackness. My academic work has long centered on Black radicalism and state violence. Earlier on the Black Panther Party, which I will always be at the center of my own scholarship and politics. But more recently, I've been writing about the drug war and carceral state. But I thought it was so kind of Professor Butler to reach out to me to ask me to actually talk about the way I spend a lot of my time. And I see it as the third part of my career, which is working as a union organizer and why I was brought to that. So I'm going to talk about some of the politics of class and labor and its intersection with global anti-Blackness. But in the tradition of kind of Black radical tradition, I also want to talk about how it's been fought and what its solutions are. So in many ways, the United States is going through this amazing revived labor movement. We are watching strikes. We have 48,000 workers at UC on strike right now. Of course, we had the National Railway strike, but a lot of the morning campaigns for this were led by Black women. And I think one of the challenges that we face is this changing same in which the white working class becomes the stand-in for working class people. And this is, of course, a historical product of white supremacy, of forced labor, of slavery, of parent folk democracy, but it's something that's still with us. And it's one of the biggest reasons I think that we don't have a social democracy like other wealthy countries in the world. So be that national health insurance or higher rates of unionization, the role of white supremacy has been central in damaging really a redistributive state and a strong and vibrant union movement. So one of the examples that comes to mind most recently to me was the 2016 election of Donald Trump. Much of the mainstream media, not only Fox, but also the liberal media, really defined Trump's win in terms of the white working class. And an example that was given to talk about this was that Case and Deaton, these two demographers, did a study about the declining life expectancy of white working class people. And the argument was that their life expectancy was declining more quickly than Black and brown populations. Now, what's striking about this is that they didn't compare white working class people to Black working class people. They compared them to all Black people. And I think to me, that is just the perfect metaphor for how we don't get to represent working class people, even though we are disproportionately the working class of this country that has done so much of the work that has built the wealth. So a couple of points about that. I think that one of the challenges that we face in labor organizing is that race is often the meta language of power. So in my own struggles in organizing, one of the things that I've seen, even when we have very class-based discussions about how to raise up different job categories who have different amounts of pay and status, you can't get more class-based than job category. That some of the older leadership saw this in racial terms, even though the racial composition of these other job categories is not disproportionately Black or brown. But the idea that I think is deeply internalized that any loss of status is often translated into racial terms. And this is part of what can create enormous anger and even violence, right? The white population's sense that any loss of status is somehow experienced racially. So abstract processes like globalization and neoliberal, decreasing in living standards is racialized and becomes a function of white racial resentment. And I think that it is today, and it has remained a huge challenge of how to change that, how to organize, and to try to create worker solidarity. But the problem of white supremacy is a foundational one historically, and I think it's something we continue to push against today. Of course, we are in a moment of rising racial fascism, and at the core of that is anti-Blackness and anti-immigrant status. But again, there's a lot of economic content that's driving this, but that economic anger and resentment is translated into a racial frame. And that's going to live on long before Donald Trump does. So that's part of the framing device. And the third thing I would say is that while we're having this amazing upsurge of unions, and this is true locally at Rutgers too, especially of the unions the ACME unions that cover dining hall workers, maintenance workers, that the question of union democracy is also a racial question. It's actually going into the labor movement, and now being part of the national AAUP, I'm seeing that many of the unions that represent Black and Brown workers and Spanish-speaking workers, that they're overwhelmingly represented by white men, many of whom do not speak Spanish. And so, in thinking about global anti-Blackness, I think that this is a huge issue, these core issues of democracy, not only in political institutions, but in economic institutions like labor unions. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about solutions, because those are my favorite things. How do we fight global anti-Blackness in the labor movement? At the dawn of the Biden presidency, the most vital sector of the labor movement is in dialogue with the Movement for Black Lives call for reinvestment in communities of color. From the Chicago Teachers Union fighting for the rights of homeless students during the pandemic, to public sector unions at Rutgers demanding layoff protections for the most vulnerable, a new generation of labor activists sees workplace struggles as an essential staging ground for racial and gender justice. The turn towards something that I call intersectional unionism matters because it is the new face of labor militancy. In contrast to the images of a predominantly white male workforce in hard hats and heavy industry that has dominated the popular imagination of unions over the past 3/4 of a century, this new labor movement is Black, brown, and female. It is steeped in the social justice unionism that has been growing since the early 1970s. Black feminist concepts such as intersectionality and prison abolition have influenced a younger generation of labor organizers. They have repudiated the Cold War's narrow bread and butter unionism, which benefited only the most elite workers who were overwhelmingly white and male. Quote, as George Meany said, this is the famous quote from George Meany that embodies this: "Why should we worry about organizing groups of people who do not want to be organized?" Said the president of the AFL-CIO in 1972. The organized fellow is the only fellow that counts. And we can guess what color that fellow is. Today, women of color workers in caregiving professions are at the forefront of labor struggle. Despite the focus on the white working class and popular discourse, Black workers have the highest rates of unionization in all racial groups in the United States. In 2020, unions represented 13.9% of African-American workers compared to 12% for white workers, according to the US Bureau of Labor Statistics. Higher rates of Black union participation can be traced largely to Black employment in the public sector, which has been key to Black economic advancement since the New Deal. And I just want to make the point that the attack on the state, especially the redistributive state, is an expression of anti-Blackness. Part of the fury at the state has to do with historic patterns of Black employment and in public sector unionism. So the two are inseparable from each other. Compared to the private sector, of course, public sector has much higher rates of organizing. Over the past decade, public sector unions in K through 12 and higher ed have moved past single issue fights over wages and benefits to more inclusive demands based on the needs of the students and their families. And I'm going to conclude by talking about the Chicago Teachers Union, which is my absolute, makes me want to get up in the morning. They have deeply influenced our own union, and I think they are one of the most powerful forces, economic forces, that's fighting anti-Blackness and the neoliberal political economy that's essential to it. Visionary Black female leaders like the late Karen Lewis and the current president, Stacey Davis Gates of the CTU, reconceptualized the terrain of labor struggle as a fight against privatization and structural racism. In 2013, Mayor Rahm Emanuel used mayoral control to order the closing of 50 schools serving Black children. This devastating swipe at the public school system meant that not only children of color lost their schools, but the entire workforce from bottom to top lost their jobs. Cafeteria workers, clerks, teachers and their assistants, janitors, and even the principals were laid off. Quote from Stacey Davis Gates, "It had a devastating impact on Black working class people, not only on Black working class people, but Black middle class people as well. We have jobs because Black people live in the city and send their children to public schools. If Black people do not trust the public schools, there are no jobs." In response, Karen Lewis helped to pioneer an innovative form of organizing called bargaining for the common good that used unions as a tool for transforming the lives of low-income Black and brown families in the city. Quote, "The struggle is about justice and equity. Teachers are tasked with creating the common good by offering a great education. And so our contract should also represent good to give us the schools that make sure that happens." And the way that this was manifest is that they actually made a demand around affordable housing in Chicago as a teachers union. So I think that while we're facing really these forces of racial fascism, that it's about language and the right to represent and to strip us of our humanity, there's also a big economic component, which is trying to deny us the essential things that we need: healthcare, education, and clean water. So I want to highlight that as a part of anti-Blackness that struggles over privatization, the public goods, that the attack on this is, it's not only a colorblind search for profit, it is truly racial capitalist. And I think it's an attack not only on the recipients of the services, but with disproportionate Black employment in the state sector, it's an attack on the people that work for the state. So, we're in hard times, but I have to say I found enormous inspiration in watching this generation of Black female trade unionists, and very recently in Spelman and in Morehouse, they've opened a program specifically that Naomi Williams is involved with to train more Black labor strategists and organizers. And that I think that this is one of the most important sites of organizing now for fighting the economic dimensions of anti-Blackness. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Dr. Murch. You gave us a lot to chew on. I'm still on the intersectional unionism. I'm excited about that. Okay, and now our last presenter is Dr. Kevon Rhiney. Dr. Rhiney is an associate professor of human environment geography in the School of Arts and Sciences at Rutgers University, New Brunswick. He has held research positions at the University of Oxford and the University of the West Indies. His primary research examines the conditions that drive agrarian change and the social material implications these changes pose for smallholder livelihoods. More recent research has started to explore the biopolitical dimensions of post-hurricane reconstruction efforts across the Caribbean. Dr. Rhiney has co-edited 2 books, and his work has been published in a number of interdisciplinary journals, including the Annual Reviews, Geoforum, Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, Small Acts, and World Development. He is the development section editor for Geography Compass and served as contributing author for the IPCC Special Report on Global Warming of 1.5 C. I'm assuming that's Celsius, but I could be wrong. Dr. Rhiney will remark on the anti-Blackness of climate change and economics on Black economic autonomy in the Caribbean. Dr. Rhiney, welcome.
Thank you so much, Akisi. And it's a pleasure being in such community. It's really great, thinking about Rutgers and how big this place is. I'm really happy to have met Kim and, being able to be part of this initiative. I'm really, really looking forward to the conversations at the end. So I'm going to jump into my presentation. I have a PowerPoint, but the PowerPoint, you'll see it's not supposed to be it's not meant to really get into stats or anything. It's just more to kind of provide some context to what I'll be discussing with you. So I'm going to start off by showing this quote. So this is an excerpt that was taken from a statement that was issued by Hilary Beckles. He's a Vice Chancellor of the University of the West Indies. And it was issued just days following the devastation Hurricanes Irma and Maria inflicted across the Caribbean in September 2017. And the statement made a forceful argument for climate reparations in the wake of what is now regarded as one of the deadliest and most destructive mid-Atlantic hurricane seasons in modern history. And in doing this, Beckles sought to establish the ways the region's colonial legacies continue to shape its material present and its dire implications for the Caribbean's future development trajectory. And in drawing on what he termed as the current hurricane moment, Beckles, who is also the chair of the Caribbean Community Reparations Commission, seeks to counter the dominant narratives shaping Caribbean regional relief efforts and policy responses towards climate change and climate-related disasters that increasingly frame these events as exceptional, extreme, and unprecedented, while paying scant regard to the ways these events map onto much longer colonial histories of indigenous genocide, African enslavement, and ecological catastrophe. So in this brief talk, my aim is to lay out in very simple terms the rationale underlying Beckles' claims for climate reparations, a claim I argued that is premised on the presumed anti-Black, ratio-capitalist, and colonial roots of the contemporary climate crisis. Beckles' provocation situates regional discourses on climate change within a much broader political and ethical context that foregrounds the current climate crisis as an extension of a colonial past that continues to shape the region's subordinate position in an uneven global racial capitalist system. So in this regard, the region's disproportionate vulnerability to the adverse effects of a changing climate cannot be separated from the historical conditions and logics that brought about the contemporary world and Western modernity. The expansion of industry in Western Europe, beginning in the late 18th century, and related shift towards fossil-based fuels went hand in hand with European occupation in the Americas. The genocide of indigenous peoples, African enslavement, and the establishment of plantation economies paved the way for the Industrial Revolution, a period marked by large-scale expansion of industry, mechanized manufacturing, and the establishment of the factory system. In many ways, Beckles' reference to the horrific history that dwells in the ruins of the present disrupts attempts to theorize a contemporary moment as a radical rupture from the past. For Beckles and a growing number of Caribbean scholars and activists, discourses on and responses to climate change cannot be separated from the longer colonial histories that continue to structure present-day vulnerabilities throughout the region. Growing calls for climate reparations are therefore tied to an understanding and recognition of an accumulated debt owed to former European colonies that now bear the brunt of the climate burden. The Industrial Revolution that is often celebrated as a watershed moment for European modernity and progress also signals the beginning of the current climate crisis, with mean global temperatures increasing by almost 1 degree Celsius since the mid-1700s. So the consequence of this increase in global mean temperature are quite wide-ranging. with significant negative implications for the Caribbean, particularly small island and low-lying coastal states. In general, the records point to the emergence of a new regional climate regime marked by warmer temperatures, shifting rainfall patterns, more intense storms, and other climate extremes, and higher mean sea levels. Both global and regional model predictions suggest that the Caribbean's climate will continue to change in significant ways throughout the course of this century. So by and large, these trends point to a worrying and uncertain future for the Caribbean, which has been made worse over the years by the inability of the global community to agree to common solutions in tackling this worsening global climate problem. The Caribbean, despite its low contribution to greenhouse gas emissions, remains one of the most vulnerable regions to climate change impacts under all scenarios above plus 1.5 degrees Celsius. And just to give some context here, roughly we've seen 0.8 degrees Celsius increase in global mean temperatures since the mid-1700s. So when I talk about plus 1.5 C, I'm talking about a plus 1.5 C degrees increase using the mid-1700s as a baseline, right? So what we've seen is that this impasse is not only a policy issue, but signifies an ethical and political and philosophical conundrum, one that is at the heart of the ongoing climate justice movement that seeks to hold those countries that have historically contributed the most to the ongoing climate crisis accountable. This also forms a basis for critiques of the notion of an Anthropocene that suggests a singular and undifferentiated humanity, which in turn fails to recognize the uneven historical ways different groups or genres of humans and nation states have been forcefully inserted in the global economy, and how these continue to shape contemporary climate inequities. So these critiques point to the need to break away from the universalizing and Eurocentric discourses that animate current understandings of climate change. And tied to this is an understanding that the solution to our current climate problem may very well lie outside of Western modernity's way of knowing, being, and relating. And of course, with the obvious paradox being that our struggle is to save a world that was founded on the subjugation, decimation, and ending of other worlds. So what many proponents of the Anthropocene have overlooked is that the critique of the plantation economy and colonial exploitation as a planetary socio-ecological catastrophe was already contained within popular discourses and cultural practices of those who lived through and survived it. The transatlantic slave trade and the plantation economy that it supported were a key step in initiating European industrialization as a global project and fueling the great acceleration in unequal energy use that we now understand as the Anthropocene. The first internal critiques came from those living through it in the form of resistance to slavery and rejection of the human and ecological exploitation of the transatlantic and trans-Pacific plantation economy. In other words, the human crisis of enslavement, indigenous genocide, and the associated deforestation and clearing of land for gold mining and monocrop sugar plantations already instantiated the violence of ecocidal extraction, human disposability, and industrial ruination that began with the consuming of the Caribbean and the Americas, leaving its mark on the planetary scale. And in his seminal publication, Capitalism and Slavery, Eric Williams noted that the complete clearing of forests on Caribbean islands, such as Barbados and St. Vincent, led the way for the kind of increased soil erosion and environmental collapse that we saw by the early 1700s. Massive deforestation left such islands more vulnerable to hurricanes when they came, and they depleted their water supply, leading to the very first European efforts at forest conservation in islands like St. Vincent and Tobago. So I'm arguing here that it is important to situate the critique of the man-made ecological transformation of the entire planet in these early Caribbean histories, which made clear the impact of monocrop plantations, extractive industries, ecological sacrifice zones, and disposable labor in the emerging global economy. Likewise, the development of counter-plantation modes of life and the subsequent establishment of various strands of Caribbean radical thought and politics have long sought to stem colonial and neo-colonial capitalist extraction by generating creative ways of living in and against such worlds that would negate the extractive drives of the Anthropocene, restore ecological balance, and infuse social natures with spiritual meaning. These cultural prefigurations and imaginations of another world by the enslaved, by Maroons, by the Haitian revolutionaries, by Caribbean proto-peasantries, by enslaved women's resistance, and by counter-plantation practices and culture building arose out of a critique of the ecocidal and genocidal propensities that already existed in what may be regarded as a proto-Anthropocene. So this strand of work recognizes that Caribbean people have been living through, analyzing and challenging the global scale colonial imperial ecological transformation since its beginnings, because their own lives and bodies were involuntarily implicated in it through displacement, disposability, and premature death. It is therefore important to situate contemporary debates about the Anthropocene in relation to these earlier critiques of plantation, slavery, and capitalism as a global system of uneven development, because it informs the current Caribbean demands for responsibility, reparations, and payment of loss and damages. Once we understand climate vulnerability as a product of colonial plantation economies and capitalist underdevelopment, this leads to the theorization of the coloniality of climate itself, which leads to a bridging of the calls for slavery reparations and for climate reparations. So in closing, I return to Beckel's reference to the way the devastation caused by the hurricanes was revelatory of the horrific history that dwells in the ruins of the present. Such statement draws attention to the ways the current climate crisis maps onto a long array of colonial violence and subjugation in ways that disrupt teleological notions of temporality, shaped in large part by a modernist conceptualization of time that is only held together by clearly defined distinctions between the past and the present. Instead, I argue that the present moment reveals the multiple colonial afterlives that persist in the here and now, and works in unique ways to counter post-colonial imaginaries of sovereignty and progress. Imaginaries that often erase longer histories of structural and racial anti-Black violence that have been central to the making and unmaking of the Caribbean. So a Caribbean critique of the Anthropocene and the ongoing climate crisis thus offers counter-imaginaries of the past, present, and future, arising borrowing from McCatrick's phrase here, demonic grounds, an alternative praxis of being human. I'll stop there, but I'm really looking forward to the kind of conversation at the end. But I think this kind of captures some of the questions I've been trying to address in my own work. So thank you so much.
Wow. Thank you all so much. Thank you to Drs. Rhiney, Murch, and Alexander-Floyd for your contributions. My name is Shanti Rosado. I am an assistant professor at Rutgers and co-PI of Insurgent Intersections. I want to thank everyone who's attending. I'm seeing some familiar names in the chat, and I'm so honored that you're here. So thank you so much for coming. Wanted to remind everyone that as we get into this conversation that you can add questions to the Q&A, and we will be getting to those in a little bit. I think there's a lot of what you've all contributed that really speaks to how anti-Blackness is tied to other structures of oppression, whether it's class, whether it's gender, and sexism, violence against Black women, whether it's, class, right? And so there's a lot of various structures that you're all talking about. I'm wondering first, are there any other comments that you'd like to add about how anti-Blackness is supported by or operationalized by other structures of oppression that you see in your work? Yes, your cat is so beautiful.
I mean, I'll just add that, you know, a lot of the work I'm doing is really around climate justice. And, you know, it's really interesting to see how former European slaving nations, the kind of position that they take, right? Especially when it comes down to admitting rights and responsibility. And, you know, I think it ties into some of the points that were made earlier by Drs. Murch and Alexander-Floyd about, you know, what is kind of usually considered as normal. It usually means, you know, kind of ongoing violence for people of color and for people of African descent. And so what you're seeing happening now at the international scene, especially with the kind of ways in which, like, you know, big emitting countries like even the US, Canada, and Western European countries are like not really supporting any ambitious kind of targets for emission reduction, is really being okay with the fact that as it stands, the people who are dying are primarily people of color. So the current climate crisis is really a racial and capitalist crisis, right? And so it's kind of very interesting to think about what is made visible from what is not by the kind of terms that we use, such as like Anthropocene, that tends to kind of erase those differences.
Mm-hmm. And the key issue, I mean, one of the key issues obviously is governance, right? And people, you know, the kind of normalization around catastrophe. Well, this is just happening, and what can we do? And the push to have us just become accustomed to something that is absolutely the product of the choices that we make, the choices that we have made, as you pointed out, over time, and that we continue to make right now. And you know, I want to lift up Lila Fernandez has a great work that's out, and it's on open access on around the politics of water in India. I mean, it's just her case studies for India, but lots of the same things that she talks about conceptually and politically can apply to Jackson, Mississippi, or other places, you know, that are dealing with the realities of climate issues, right? Because it's questions of governance. What are the choices that we're making? And how are we reading, as Donna pointed out, you know, the state and, you know, looking out for the public good as somehow, you know, connected with supporting immigrants, people of color. And so the kind of anti-Blackness that happens in that way, in questions of governance. And I do deal with that in my work. And also the question we're talking, I think somebody talked about, like, for example, Vice President Harris, right? One of the tricky things about this moment in terms of our demographic diversity and increased visibility, you know, sometimes we have new faces in new places, but the same old politics or politrics. And so that's a whole nother conversation about, you know, how to work to keep people and institutions accountable, right? And have you know, rhetoric and language to do that. And at the same time, that doesn't actually, you know, support, you know, the anti-racism that absolutely happens when, you know, new people are in different types of positions, right? And they're seen as space invaders and attacked and acted out on. So
sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. I guess I would follow up and connect the 2 points that were made. 2 things. I was on a call earlier this week with a fellow activist who's part of the Portal Project coming out of University of Illinois, Chicago, and she's at Egypt at the climate talks. And she was talking about how what's happening is that, one, the complete exclusion of the Global South from being involved in any substantive way in these negotiations, and that the kinds of corporate mediated solutions have meant that governments are giving enormous amounts of money to extractive companies for these kinds of projects. And she was talking about that, you know, the way that people talk about kind of the neoliberal state, the way they used to talk about it is that it's just a shrinking state that is, depriving people of resources. But I think the best way to understand it, and it's true in this case in the climate crisis, is that it becomes a mechanism for the upward redistribution of wealth to the most powerful. And so she was, just devastated by watching this happen. It's like, how did the climate talks become a huge corporate giveaway with countries, particularly the United States and Europe and the wealthiest countries, but also forcing other countries to sign on to give enormous contracts to these big companies. And the other piece that I would add is, I guess, just a framing, something I meant to say, but I think I left out, is that for me, the turn to the union movement really happened in 2016. And it was the combination of the election of Trump, and then I was in Brazil 2 days after the election of Bolsonaro. And that was one of the just most frightening experiences that I've ever had. And it was a quiet experience. It was the experience of meeting with people who had family that had been killed during the dictatorship. These are serious organizers and leftists. And when they were talking about Bolsonaro's election, they said, they didn't talk about it a lot. They said anything could happen. And that was very sobering for me, because I recognize the enormity of fear and consequence. And it is something that I absolutely feel about our country now. And one of the issues about Eurocentrism is that the way that people have narrated fascism and racial fascism is so focused on the interwar years in Europe, on Italy and Germany. And I have long believed, in that tradition of Aimé Césaire and the brilliant Caribbean intellectuals whose arguments were that to really understand racial fascism, you look to the process of slavery, colonization, and imperialism. So that's also how I think about it. And that for me was the organic connection. That's what I wanted to go into, a concrete form of organizing that I thought was grounded with a large organization that makes it possible to have really a base organization, because a lot of the organizing we see today are affinity groups and not-for-profits, and they are extremely important, and I have worked with them as well. But it was actually that experience of racial fascism in the United States and Brazil that motivated me. So I wanted to add that.
And that's critical, because people think that this can't happen here, right? And and say that. I remember in one discussion, I was talking, actually talking about the kind of connections to fascist ideology and Trump and Trumpism. And someone said, well, I'm a whole lot more optimistic about the outcome of the presidential election that we've had. I said, well, but even if he loses, right, there's still a problem, because the political context that gave rise to him is with us, and it's going to be with us, and it's alive and well. And that's going to be, something that we're going to have to deal with and address.
Yeah, I had a question for Dr. Rhiney. And this is, purely out of curiosity, as we're talking about, these issues of, the rise of fascism in the US and in the, global North, if you will, that there are the folks who have to deal with it in the global South, right? And I'm wondering how that plays out in your work, and if that comes up at all. Just given that, the context is different, but there's still, as you say, this connection, very obvious connection to the afterlives of colonialism in the Caribbean.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think it depends on the context, right? Because certainly I think just listening to Donna, the Brazil-US context is a very interesting one, right? Because, Brazil has the second largest Black population outside of Nigeria. And that comes with its own set of dynamics as well, in terms of really thinking about how ideas around racial fascism gets kind of connected with things related to the environment. So actually, I was in Brazil like 2 months ago, and I went to some of these 2 quilombos just outside of the fringe of like Rio de Janeiro. It's like these are maroon communities in Brazil, and they're within like the kind of buffer zones for these protected areas. They're also kind of, experiencing some of the same issues when it comes on to thinking about their ability to exist within those spaces. And for them, they don't separate the social struggles from the environmental struggles. You really realize in those settings that what is happening on the climate front cannot be separated from what's happening in, grassroots organizing. Environmental justice issues are very much tied to social justice issues. And I think, I think Nikol, you mentioned this is a governance, but this governance is also hitting at this heart of liberalism, right? Like this idea of we expect these systems to work for us, but the ways in which these systems are already set up, right, is really like they normalize trauma for Black people. And so when you think about this idea, I think it was Alexander Wahilia's book, where he was talking about this idea of liberalism as being the preserve of the fully human. And so he was kind of making the argument that, how does liberalism treat folks who weren't considered as fully human? What does rights and responsibilities look like for those groups of people that were marked as less than human? And how does those kind of the afterlives map themselves on to the current day? And so, what we consider as stable and normal for the quote unquote fully human might represent violence and trauma for those who have been marked as not fully human. And so that becomes really interesting in thinking about why it is that Black people have to go the extra way to kind of get their voices heard. It's almost like the system is not really meant for us, right? And I think that connects the struggles that's happening in the global North with the struggles that are happening in the global South. They're not much different if you think about it.
That's brilliant. Donna, I think you raised your hand, but I wasn't sure if that was on purpose or a mistake.
I'm sorry, I was basically trying to applaud.
Oh, gotcha. Thank you. So I see that we have some questions in the chat, but I want to ask you one more question before we get to questions from the audience. And this is, very much related to what you were just talking about, Dr. Rhiney, Kevon, which is the issue of solutions and how solutions kind of can be framed as solutions, but are actually just perpetuating the status quo with a different face, right, or a different name. And so I'm really interested, we are interested as a group in your thoughts about how essentially neoliberal solutions to anti-Blackness have worked or not. And this includes things like diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, murals and public displays, corporate statements, et cetera, et cetera. Really interested to hear your thoughts on these supposed solutions.
The problems with the solutions, right? What we've seen in Hurricane Katrina, in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, is that recovery efforts weren't really meant for the communities, primarily Black communities that were displaced by the storm. What you saw was really what we call disaster gentrification, or what Naomi Klein calls disaster capitalism. So, wrapped up in these kind of neoliberal kind of solutions is, issues related to racial inequality that we have to kind of attend to. In the case of Puerto Rico, what you're seeing is, a lot of funds are going into privatizing beachfront properties and so on, and it's really kind of displacing folks, local communities there. And it's not just in Puerto Rico, in Barbuda, there's a big push to kind of switch their land systems to privatize their land systems as a way of, quote unquote, attracting investments into the area. You're seeing this happening in St. Martin as well, with the Dutch government, contracting the World Bank to do their resiliency fund. And so in a lot of these cases, what you're seeing is these kind of solutions disguised as building back better, as kind of resilience building initiatives, are in many ways displacing communities of color in these post-disaster landscapes. I think the solution to that is kind of tied to a comment that I saw Professor Butler putting in the chat, right? When she was like, she said precisely what animates the Insurgent Intersections project, right? Who have lived with and worked through the conditions of anti-Blackness have valuable insights to lead us towards transformative solutions. Mm-hmm. I think a lot of the solutions that are being formed they're not including the voices of people who are actually affected. And so it becomes a governance issue. It becomes a justice issue. Mm-hmm. And it's really about finding ways in which we can have a much more equitable kind of governance system where the people who are actually impacted the most actually have an opportunity to share their opinions and give their own insights. I think listening to them, listening to their stories, and really kind of thinking about different ways in which we go about planning and doing kind of recovery, thinking about recovery in different ways, I think it's one way forward. And I think, what you're seeing in Puerto Rico with these, what they call community brigades, where right after Maria, where the government was not, you weren't seeing the mighty force of the U.S. Army, or the federal government was at an impasse. People started doing things for themselves. And, what they were doing in Puerto Rico and what is happening now, I think is creating an opportunity for us to kind of rethink ways in which we can kind of organize recovery efforts moving forward, while also holding the state accountable. I think that's where the challenge is, in terms of how can you promote kind of mutual aid, community grassroots organizing, while not letting the government off the hook. I think maybe Professor Alexander-Floyd, you might have some points there in terms of how we can get to that. But I think that's the challenge. Whereas we're kind of talking about having greater grassroots organizing, we're not letting the government off the hook, because that to me, I think, is a big part of the puzzle as well.
I absolutely agree. And I think that, part of what, I like about union organizing is that, done correctly, people are thinking not just in immediate terms, but also in terms of a long game, right? And that it takes effort and time to actually build power, to coordination, community, it takes some things that aren't necessarily flashy. It takes long hours, having conversations with people, and organizing them. And when that happens, it can be an amazing thing to watch in terms of how that unfolds. And people are ripe, right? People are ripe for discussions about these critical issues, because they can get it, and it's something that we have to attend to. I'm glad that you mentioned New Orleans. I remember the first time I went back on a flight, it was the widest flight to New Orleans I'd ever seen. That and it was purposeful because of what money-hungry corporations and groups were doing to basically buy up the city. One of the questions in the Q&A talked about what to do with denial and disavowal and the repression of the realities of social inequality, including anti-Blackness. That's the kind of I don't know that an emphasis on murals and symbolic measures can be the limit of things, because that can lead to people having, feeling that they're doing something and really conceptualizing pain and distress as something that's abstract. But, there has to be, a way in which, this is continually dealt with, on different levels of scale. And it's obviously not easy. It didn't get passed in New Jersey, but even New Jersey had a bill proposed to prohibit the teaching of critical race studies, right? When I proposed that class a couple of years back, I was like, gosh, I hope I have enough students for the class to make, because it's real, it's a limited kind of, a body of legal thinking, class was full when it was taught, but it is going to be a continual struggle on different levels of scale to continue to have those conversations. As many of you will recall, after Katrina, one of the most odious comments that came out from a state legislator in Louisiana was, finally we've learned, we found a way to deal with the public housing problem in New Orleans, right? That's the kind of attitude that's prevalent. Right. When you grow up in particular places and spaces, many things are in your face, not all of it. But I do believe what Malcolm X said, that everything south of Canada is south. Right. You just have to reckon, things present themselves differently at times, but are still very much destructive in terms of, because it's not just about attitudes, although that's there. And they're not everybody has ideas about race or white privilege that are just implicit bias. So it's really it's very explicit. So you have to have some willful denial, not to understand those things. And it actually reminded me, I was at Virginia Tech when the mass killings happened, back in 2007. The white residents of Blacksburg and the surrounding towns thought, how could this happen in our wonderful picturesque place? It was just something that was just so unbelievable. Every person of color said something to the effect of, this would happen in Blacksburg. It absolutely resonated with our experience of feeling like we were in, when people use adjectives like Babylon, Vietnam, just something traumatic and catastrophic. But there is a persistent and willful kind of effort to suppress literally what is in plain sight, right? And so, that has to, the push to make people uncomfortable has to continue, and to be very bold and direct and consistent about it, and to have conversations about that.
I have a quick comment, and then I know we need to open it up to conversation. I agree absolutely with Nikol and Kevon. I think just to give a few concrete examples, in terms of thinking about DEI, I have been on diversity committees and used the language of DEI in certain environments. I find it useful, but in talking to Black students about it, I was going back to my old alma mater, Williams College, which is a brutally racist institution. And I was really stressing to them that DEI can be used strategically, but it's also a framework that emerges out of the rolling back of the accomplishments of the 60s and 70s. And it's
right.
a vision of amelioration in the context of a retreat from real redistributive politics, focus on labor, of getting people jobs, and really focusing on the racial structure of the American economy. So I talked to them about the Black radical tradition and gave them a concrete example from the organizing of the Afro-American Association, which brought together African, West Indians, and Black Americans, partially because they were talking about how do we fight for and craft racial demands, and then showing them the Black Panther 10-point program, not to have them replicated, but to have them figure out how to adapt these sets of ideas and then apply them to their own context. The other quick thing I wanted to say is that one of the best examples of neoliberal solutions, which truly breaks my heart, is what's happened after the largest protests in history, the George Floyd protests of 2020. We now have legislation named after the people that were killed by the police, like the George Floyd Act, that are providing federal funding, unprecedented amounts of federal funding to local police departments, with the idea if that we provide funding and training, somehow we will make things better. But I mean, it's like a surrealist poem, naming it after the victims that have been killed by the police. So I think, again, it's this seeing the racial capitalist state violence piece being inseparable from a racial capitalist piece, because of course, the police are deeply fiscal. I'm working on a project called $1 Million Hoods, where we won a lawsuit against LAPD, and we have 600,000 documents from the LAPD. The documents are filled with concerns of fiscal concerns, asset forfeiture, cost, revenue. These are economic institutions as well as political institutions.
I was taking notes because that was amazing. Thank you so much. So this kind of, what you all have mentioned relates to a question in the Q&A from our keynote speaker from last year, Dr. Leslie Alexander, who has recently joined us at Rutgers. And we're super excited to have her here. So Dr. Alexander asks, says, it's deeply disturbing to me to see the patterns and cycles of denial about anti-Blackness. For example, when George Floyd was murdered, most white Americans acted like that was the first time the police had ever killed a Black person. Beyond our scholarship, how do we break the cycles of denial, ignorance, and disavowal? Beyond our scholarship, if you have time. Beyond your scholarship.
Well, I've spoken to this already. I don't know if Donna or Kevon want to weigh in, because I could continue.
Yeah, I could jump in. I mean, that's a good point. And, this is a conversation I've had with a lot of folks, particularly some of the my former students who are into environmental activism now, and who are engaging with, ordinary community folks, who are trying to make sense of what's happening in the Caribbean. And I think, it's the challenge. The challenge for many of them is that the kind of discourses that are taking place are, one, framed in such a way that they exclude the kind of framings that make sense for people in terms of their daily lives. So it's like using, these terms that build back better, resilience. Like I always ask someone, when you hear someone talk about resilience, you should ask them to explain to you precisely what they mean by resilience. And so I think for us as academics, one of the work that we have to be doing is that we can't have these conversations among ourselves. We have to really engage local communities and really kind of, help to build their ability to kind of break down some of these discourses, to push back. And I see this in the work that a lot of my students are doing, actually, in terms of working with, grassroots communities and so on. The other thing I want to point out too is that in terms of my own colleagues and friends who are white and so on, one of the things I constantly say to them is that you can't, it's not okay for you to say that you're not, for instance, racist, or to kind of use this card to say, well, I didn't even know that this thing is happening or whatever. Like, you have to be very, very anti-racist. And I think that's a discussion that a lot of folks are having now, to say, people need to be a little bit more forthright and upfront in terms of facing the facts, being uncomfortable, and having those type of conversations, right?
But everybody needs to be taking Black studies classes, Africana studies classes. I mean, this is what happens in those kinds of courses, right? Having an it is, it can feel like combat duty to teach without combat duty pay.
Right.
But that's exactly what we do. That's exactly what we do. And that's why, even though it's difficult, I've actually come to appreciate certain types of across the curriculum requirements, so that those kinds of conversations can take place, or people would never otherwise, going through their college experience, at least having to confront that and having to deal with those kinds of critical issues. So to continue to stake that claim, where we have influence in the classroom, and that's why they're going after it. That's why people are going after it, because they know it's critical. And they know it's critical. But one of the things that one of my favorite union sayings, if we fight, we win.
Yeah.
I feel that in my soul. Because if we don't fight, there's no chance that we will.
Exactly. Yeah.
And so, I'm not pessimistic. I'm a realist, and find that there's always a way that we can come together and make common cause and fight to make a difference.
Yeah, go for it, Donna.
I was going to say that I think that, and this I learned from studying the genesis of the Panther Party, that some of the most important places for catalytic change are when you have the intersection between resources and the absence of resources. So it was the first generation of Black people gaining access to high school and to community college in the early 60s that laid the intellectual infrastructure for what later became the Black Panther Party. Similarly, at San Francisco State, it was Black students doing tutoring in Hunters Point and really being immersed and seeing the challenges of these migrant communities. And so one of the problems now, and I think especially with the DEI framework, it works well for trying to fight for change within institutions, but I don't think it works well as a mobilizing strategy because it focuses on changing attitudes. And I think if you really want to make social change, you go to the most concrete forms of struggle that will directly affect people's lives. So what was one of our biggest victories? Of course, it's being fought now. It was the fight for bail reform. Bail reform made such a huge difference in people's lives. Now, of course, it is being overturned and systematically fought. So I think in trying to do this kind of racial justice work, figuring out how to go to places where resources are needed and work in service of others through a process of solidarity. And I think that's how we really learn politically. I'm not saying that we shouldn't, think about our attitudes, but I think that attitudes are actually transformed by action.
Yes, absolutely. So I wanted to get to a couple more questions, and let's see if we can. First, a question from Dennison Bonady from our own department. And Dennison asks, can you comment on how Nikki Haley's comments about Raphael Warnock I think you mean intersects with both the question of Black American loyalty as well as the ideas of Toni Morrison's on the backs of Blacks? So if I recall correctly, Nikki Haley said that Raphael Warnock should be deported, right? That he should be deported from the country. So that's what Dennison is referring to. Any ideas on that?
That somebody can, that I can speak about publicly? Yes. Part of what I talk about in my book, right, is production of Black people, and not only Black people, but that's what I focus on as liminal subjects, right? As being kind of betwixt and between social positions, either as model minorities, prototypical super minorities, or part of the or abject, and other. So with Haley, that's part of the that's part of the playbook, right? In terms of coding Black people as abject, and layering that not only with, of course, although most people don't realize this, that there are immigrants of African descent, but to layering on that very racist kind of trope there. And so it's a very, what has happened with that particular election is a kind of cynical approach by the Republican Party in terms of putting forward a uniquely unqualified candidate, right, in hopes of basically peeling off a already slim majority in the Senate. And it's one of the difficult things is that post 1965 there has been a kind of in some ways an overemphasis on voting, right? Voting is critical. If it were not, people would not be trying to do everything they could to avoid voting from happening. We have fought to have a right to make demands on the state, right, to assert, our right to make demands on the state. That's undermined at every turn. It's important politically, but it's not all that's important politically, right? So social movement activity and organizing continue to be critically important, and the kind of assault on voting rights, is likely to continue, unless there is a kind of shift in terms of the horizon politically, so that people can begin to imagine platforms and have a vision for the world that goes beyond the limits of a two-party system. We're not going to, I believe, get the kind of change that we need for any kind of issue, and most especially climate change. I would also like to get Kevon's take on what's happening with the G20. I don't know, that might have to happen at the after party.
Yeah, it might have to happen at the after party. So I was wondering, we have to close out at 7, but we have a question, and I hope that we can maybe get like a 30-second response from each of you. And that question's from Janaya. Hey, Janaya. And the question is, what made each of you so passionate about combating racism, and what advice do you have for students wanting to create change of their own? And shout out to my students in the audience.
I mean, my quick comment would be that, I live it, I see it around me. And one of the things that helped was just reading, particularly falling in love with the Black radical tradition, and that really opened up my eyes to things that I never knew before, given different types of insights. The other thing I'd say is getting involved, having conversations, even the ones that make you uncomfortable, and putting yourself out there. That really helped me personally growing.
I'd say that for me, like Kevon, I see it everywhere. Racism so profoundly shaped the history of my family in ways that we all live with. And so I think I've always been interested in studying the things that have injured the people I care about and myself. And the thing that really made me translate that into an intellectual framework was Black studies. I had wonderful mentors, including Decimal Williams, who was the ambassador from Grenada, who I met after the United States invaded the country and forced her into exile. And I had the privilege of meeting her when I was very young. She gave me my copy of Wretched of the Earth, and I still have it. And also Shanti Singham, whose father came out of the non-alignment movement. So it was really a generation of Caribbean women radicals you know, who kind of taught me about the history of slavery, colonialism, and imperialism. And that for me was like that catalytic spark that made me want to be a historian and an activist.
The racism I experienced growing up led me to decide as a young person that as soon as I could, I would make sure that white people were not in control of my education. And I went to an historically Black university, Southern University and A&M College in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. And I had the great blessing to be among, I didn't even know that this was even an option in life to be a professor. I met Black professors and political scientists. And long story short, people, even the lawyers who were there, there was litigation happening with my university for desegregation in higher ed. I saw political scientists who were active in the classroom, active in the community, and lawyers who were doing things that were very powerful. And so, you know, I connected with that. And I was in a place where, you know, I was encouraged, you know, at Southern University and other HBCUs, you don't have to go looking for mentors. They go looking for you. And my mind told me, you know, you can go to law school and grad school. And so I did. And, you know, Jewel Prestige, who was one person, I'll end by saying this, she was just one person. She was really the first real Black woman, only the second to get her PhD in political science. She was one of my mentors at Southern University. She single-handedly did so much, right? Because she had intention and she did work and she had vision. And there are at least 80 people, 80 Black political scientists who were inspired to take this road up because of her work. She built institutions, departments, organizations, and she raised 5 children, you know, published and lived a long and powerful life, helped to prepare politicians, right, in the 60s and 70s, Black politicians as they were coming into office and training. And, you know, it was really a very practical example of what the world can look like and how things can be different when everybody gives their share.
Thank you so much.
Thank you to this wonderful, wonderful panel and the rich discussion that we have. I'm sure you've been engaging not only with the Q&A, but also with the chat, because the chat is popping, because you guys have been dropping such good gems to give people, students and everyone here, things to think about and things to work on and work towards. So I want to thank, on behalf of my colleagues, Dr. Shanti Rosado and Dr. Kim Butler, for everyone who joined us today for our keynote with Drs. Nikol Alexander-Floyd, Dr. Donna Murch, and Dr. Kevon Rhiney for offering your brilliance to our project, right? Insurgent Intersections. This is exactly the kinds of things, the kinds of conversations that we wanted to generate. So I thank you, we thank you for your brilliance. I also want to give a last shout out to the Institute for the Study of Global Racial Justice here at Rutgers for support. Couldn't have done it without you. And thank you all. We are continuing the conversation briefly for a little after party until about 7:30. So for those of you in the audience who can stay, please stay. We're gonna talk a little bit more, probably get to some more of the questions that we couldn't get to during the official webinar, and just keep this conversation going. Thanks so much, everyone.